Good morning. When we look at this topic, is cooperation possible in cyberspace? It's interesting that thinking over the history of cyberspace has really gone in cycles. In the beginning, the internet is based on cooperation. It's a few people, essentially like a village, where there's a lot of trust, and without cooperation, it wouldn't exist at all. That changes pretty dramatically about 20 years ago. In the mid-90s, you suddenly have a burgeoning of participation after the development of the web. See, if you look at a graph of use of the internet or websites, there's almost a hockey stick effect in which it takes off exponentially in the late 90s. And what this does is it makes the internet the substrate for business and government and a lot of other things. That greatly increases interdependence. But with interdependence comes enormous increase in vulnerability. And with the increase in vulnerability comes insecurity. And so you wind up with the creation of a problem of cooperation under insecurity, which is a classic problem in international relations. So in that sense, a lot of people said what we've gone from is a village in the early days of the internet when cooperation went without saying to the Wild West, where everything is like the dark web. But in fact, that's really not true. If you think about cyberspace today, there is a fair degree of cooperation despite the dark web. And you also have the existence of certain norms. Many of these are borrowed from other areas. In that little map of the internet or cyberspace, which is in the background period papers for the first breakout group, I try to do a mapping of this. And it's interesting how much of the norms and cooperation are borrowed from other areas. And we have said collectively as a set of governments that the internet is governed by the UN Charter and by international law. But what does that mean in practice? We've seen reports of the group of government experts that have tried to lay out some of the norms for cooperation here. And what we have this morning is a set of experts who can tell us briefly, 5 minutes for each of them in their introductory remarks, how they see the existence of cooperation today. And then we'll talk a little bit about how you implement some of these things. For example, if you look at some of the principles that are in the GGE report, the last one that came out in July, don't attack critical infrastructure, a responsibility to help, don't attract CSIRTs, maintain the integrity of supply chains, develop confidence building measures and transparency. All these are pretty good things in and of themselves, pretty unexceptional. But how do you actually cooperate to make them happen? So in our panel this morning, we're going to focus on, can you cooperate to do some of these things that are described? So that's a place to start. Let me say, I'm not going to give you the full biographies of each of the speakers. You have in your packet a speaker's background where you can read in great detail. With 6 speakers, if I gave you their full biographies, that would eat up about a quarter of our time. So instead, I'll just briefly identify them, and then you can look them up for greater detail yourself. But let me start with Thomas Fitschen, who's the Director for UN Cyber Policy and Counter-Terrorism of the Federal Republic of Germany Foreign Ministry. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Is cooperation possible in cyberspace? I hope you didn't invite a German diplomat to discuss the question and expect the answer would be no. Because I'm convinced that cooperation is not only possible, it is necessary. But in order to make it look a little more familiar, maybe we should slightly rephrase it and call it cooperation on cyberspace rather than in cyberspace, because it shows that we are not acting in a virtual world. There are, of course, contradictory tendencies right now, no need to gloss that over. Numerous states are pursuing military cyber capabilities. In many cases, these are defensive. In others, they may be offensive, limited or not to supporting traditional military operations. Often, we simply don't know. On a different track, we have learned in recent years of large degree of state surveillance of online activities of all kinds. We've also come to realize that states are using the internet for espionage. In addition, of course, to governments, private actors are abusing the internet. Again, that's not new, so I skip the next half page of my statement on that one. But what I don't want to skip is the observation that we have reason to believe that sometimes such activities of private actors are sponsored or at least tolerated by governments. Yet, in the face of such adversity and divisiveness, we are observing remarkable instances of cooperation indeed. The UN General Assembly has turned a very sensitive issue, state surveillance of online communication, into a showcase for cooperation, and that's why I mention it here. By adopting 2 consensus resolutions, 2013 and 14, in the General Assembly on the right to privacy. Germany, Brazil, Switzerland, Austria, Norway, Liechtenstein, and others were the main sponsors. They have commissioned a special report by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the Human Rights Council has just now appointed a special rapporteur on privacy in the digital age. Well, that's cooperation in cyberspace. On the complex issue of international security as well, we are beginning to see progress. You have already mentioned the group of government experts on developments in the field of information and telecommunications in the context of international security. That's a long title, but it shows the degree of cooperation that is necessary. We have a couple of proposals in that paper. So again, these 20 experts that have worked on this have gotten together and have developed something that may be the basis for something else. At the regional level as well, we see cooperation. And the historians, and for historians, what comes to mind is maybe not so much Westphalia, but Helsinki. In 2013, the OSCE participating states agreed on an initial set of confidence-building measures to reduce the risk of conflict stemming from the use of information and communication technology. Implementation is proceeding, and work on a second set of CBMs is already at an advanced stage. Germany, as future chair of the OSCE in 2016, will take up the issue, hoping to widen and to deepen it. Similar efforts are also undertaken in other parts of the world. We believe that this work at the regional level is important, whereas it is of course true that technically a cyber attack can come from just any corner of the world. Conflict is rather more likely to break out between countries that have strange relations anyway. It is far more likely that this is the case. A cyber incident will happen between 2 neighbors than between faraway countries. So here again, regional organizations bring together such states. They provide tested and hopefully trusted fora to discuss grievances and to build confidence. At the bilateral level, we also see new levels of cooperation. Germany, for example, has established formal cyber consultations, not just with traditional allies such as the US, but also with China, Brazil, and India. Next year, we're planning to start cybersecurity dialogue with Korea. And of course, other European and other countries also have bilateral consultations of that kind. Let me maybe add one more element, and of course, I don't have to tell the East-West Institute and this audience about it. Since the entire process of discussing cybersecurity issues on the internet and their development, you have just referred to it, has been intertwined so much with private sector, civil society, academia. What we need is cooperation not just between governments. Some of my diplomatic colleagues are probably nodding here, but really whatever we have to do and governments have to step in will have to be done in close cooperation with all involved, all actors, all stakeholders, our private sector, civil society, anyone who can make a contribution. Yes, governments are called upon to make a contribution to better cooperation in or on cyberspace, but let's also be clear, it won't work without the other actors. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Udo Helmbrecht is the Executive Director of the European Agency for Network and Information Security, ENISA. Let me turn to you.
Thank you very much, and a warm welcome also from my side. I think ENISA might not be known to most of you. We are a young European governmental agency founded in 2004. I think it was a reaction of the situation in cyberspace. And if you look into Europe, we have 28 member states now with 500 million people. a bit more than US. And we're an agency to support the increase of IT security from the perspective of the European Common Market. So this is interesting because if you look to normally governmental agency, the primary purpose is to support the governments. So in our objective in the regulation, it's really set to foster this in the area of industry, government, and citizen, which is in the end a bit a challenge for citizen. So if we come to this topic about community building, capacity building, it's exactly what is the intention behind. So we are an agency in the preventive area. We also work together with Europol in the cybercrime area in a supportive way. We have for a couple of years now a European CERT, which was established. And if you look at it, the question is, how can we in Europe have an increase of security? If you look for the last, let's say, 20 years, there was a fall of the wall. We included the Eastern European states with the Western. So we have mature member states like Germany, France, UK, Sweden, which have an IT industry. And we want to speed up also with these other countries like Romania, Bulgaria, Cyprus, and so on. So what we are doing is then, on one hand, could talk like a think tank publishing papers, and we are involved in implementing legislation on a European level. I want to give you two examples which fits, I think, in this discussion. One is what we are doing with regulation in Europe, and the other one is what we are in NISA doing currently in this field. Start with our work. We do every year a so-called pan-European exercise. This is something where around 2010 the question was, what do we do on a European level when there is a cyber incident? You might remember 2007 Estonia, there was a Georgia conflict with Russia where governmental websites were shut down, and we said, what can we learn? So then we looked, and in the member states, traditionally, you have escalation procedures. If something happens, you know which Secretary of State or Minister you have to call. You have war rooms, procedures, who to evolve. On a European level, honestly, in 2010, we had nothing. Yeah? So I think we would run around like chickens, and then the news the next day would go to a commission and say, what did you do? Yeah? So the first challenge for Europe is every state has a finance minister. But IT security is sometimes in the Ministry of Interior, in the Ministry of Economy, in the Ministry of Transport. So it's a challenge then, how do you bring it together? So what we did is, on a horizontal level, we have established governmental CERTs, cooperation with the industry, and with these exercises, you can compare it with the military exercises when they have the tanks running around. We started 2012, 14, the next one is 16, and we really increased from tabletop exercise to exercise last October. We had more than 400 people participating. We have scenarios, we have software injecting incidents. You can imagine we have in essence a room where 28 member states with people are sitting. You get injections, then you have to call your member states. What do you do? A scenario could be there is a crisis because someone shuts down the governmental internet because of something in one member state that affects the other. How do you talk to the telecommunication people, to the banking sector, and so on? So we publish this on a high level on our website. I also must say, what we learn in detail, we do it. It's then confidential to the government and the member state. But in between, some lessons learned we publish there. So what we have now is in Europe then, so-called standard operational procedure, that we know on a technical level how to react, what to do. So the challenge is now what we are just working on is a vertical level. What does it mean on a governance structure? So I go now to the second point in the governance structure. We are currently discussing the so-called Network Information Security Directive, NIS Directive, which has three basic objectives. One is have a governance structure in every member state, so that you really know who is responsible, which ministry, which agency, how you do this in your member state. The second objective is information exchange, how to exchange information when there's an incident. Not only the technical information incident, but also lesson learned. So this is where we currently, together with the European Commission from NISA, support this together to discuss with industry. So it's currently in the plenary discussion of the Parliament. And the third point is then, incident reporting. We have it in the telecommunication sector in Europe, that breach notification of incidents is reported and it's collected, and we make a summary report every year. The big discussion is now in Europe, which sectors, critical infrastructure sector, and how do you report incidents? And the biggest challenge is, in most cases, industry says it's a burden, we don't want, it's a competitive issue. The governments want to have the information. So we are working on it. So to summarize the messages, we do a lot in capacity building, community building. We try to speed this up, and we have some legislative initiatives in Europe to put in a European level to have better governance and information exchange. Thank you.
Thank you. Replacing Michael Kalugin, who is listed in your program, we're fortunate to have Ilya Rogachev, who's the director of the Department of New Challenges and Threats of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Moscow. And we're lucky to have him with us today. Please.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I would concentrate on the activities of the governmental experts group that has been mentioned already today. But before that, I will say briefly that in general, lately we all witness a clear tendency to the proliferation of cyber attacks, and they also become more complex and hence carry more risks. Speaking to the gathering of the highest ranking officers of the Federal Security Service earlier this year, President Putin mentioned that cyber resources of the Russian government have been attacked about 74 million times in the year 2014. And as far as we know, the governmental resources of China and the USA have been attacked even more than that. Economic damage from hackers' attacks is measured in over $1 trillion US. So this is one of the sources that says that. I also have seen estimates from some British sources that put this figure toward $3 trillion. Lately, attacks on military and politically important critical infrastructure have multiplied. Such attacks are considered by many experts as real hostilities. In this context, while there is no legal norms on responsibility, drafting and agreeing on a set of rules of conduct of states in cyberspace becomes a more and more pressing need in our view. Such an idea has been put forward by Russia already quite some time ago, and in 2011 it introduced with other states participants of the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement a paper which was distributed as official document of the United Nations, and it is called Code of Conduct for Information Security. A revised version was resubmitted earlier this year. We are not pressing forward with this initiative in form of UN General Assembly resolution, though we're quite certain that it would have gained a very large support among member states for one only reason, that we want this document to be a consensual one. The report of the GGE that has been mentioned again earlier this summer and submitted to the UN Secretary General also calls on states to draft such a code of conduct. And in our view, this appeal is one of the most important achievements of the experts from the 20 states that take part in this working group. It was a unanimous recommendation to convene a new group in 2016 with a renewed mandate, which would start drafting a set of rules, a set of norms. The idea is that such rules would be adopted as political commitment rather than legally binding obligations by all states, and thus would exclude evading any accountability of those who cherish any kind of plans of aggressive terrorist or criminal acts in cyberspace. I should say that experts from Russia, China, other BRICS states, and some others from the outset supported this idea, but it is experts, representatives of the US and other Western states that needed to be talked into such an arrangement and convinced in the necessity of this project. There is also a number of critical important elements, beacons, so to say, on the way to a secure international information environment in this report. First, I would mention that common interest of all states in peaceful use of ICTs is reconfirmed. And this is a very important political statement, as well as the importance to continue the efforts of all the international community to prevent conflicts in cyberspace. I would stress the word to prevent conflicts. The sovereign right of states to manage ICT infrastructure on its territory is stipulated, as well as that states are sovereign in determining their national policy in the area of information security. There is a very important new provision which appeared in the report. It was recognized as unacceptable to accuse each other in carrying cyber attacks unfoundedly. Unilateral statements on involvement of this or that state in a cyber attack are recognized as insufficient to attribute a malicious act to a state. Accusations of states in organization and carrying out cyber attacks should be substantiated. And here I may refer to the previous speaker who mentioned alleged actions by the Russian Federation against Estonia and Georgia. And we've heard this many times already. I personally think that this discussion to a large extent pointless, as neither my opponent on this matter can provide any proofs, neither myself, I cannot provide any documents or whatever other evidence may be corroborating the point of view that Russia has nothing to do with this. Usually when I speak to students and they ask me this question, I say that, well, imagine Russian cyber aggression against Georgia or Estonia, and some sites do not work for a couple of days. Are you serious about it? This is all we can do? Come on, this is 12, 14 years old. I mean, this is kids stuff. But this is all I can say. So hence this provision in the report that there should be grounds when people say these things. Providing for some hidden capacities in software or hardware was recognized as illegal and malicious practice, yet another very important provision in this report. And it was introduced on the Russian initiative. One global conclusion by the group was that there is the need to enhance international cooperation in international information security. It also stressed the importance to trust-building measures, also mentioned here by my German colleague, bridging the digital gap and expanding technical assistance to developing states. Well, this year, Russian delegation will again resubmit a renewed version of our traditional UNGA resolution developments in the field of information and telecommunications in the context of international security. I have a copy which I can disseminate here if there is an interest, giving all the modifications that we have introduced into the text. And we would like it to contain not only the expression of appreciation of the activity of the group of experts, but also a renewed mandate for renewed group, which will next year work on a code of conduct, perhaps. What I would like to stress in the context of this panel is that the discussions were very difficult, as far as I know. As they say, heated debate. But what is of principled importance to us, that even in this rather unfriendly international environment, experts, we, states, can talk, we can come to conclusions, we can take into account each other's interests and points of view, and we can agree on very important things. So answering this question, yes, of course, there should be cooperation in cyberspace. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, we have Lionel Roland from the Office of Cybersecurity and Open Data of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who's participating in place of Ambassador Nemchinov.
Thank you, Professor, and good morning to everyone. Let me first apologize on behalf of Ambassador Nemchinov, who really wanted to join this meeting, but was at the last moment unable to do so. Like many other countries, France has always been an active supporter of the process aimed at building norms to enhance cooperation in cyberspace, and when possible, whenever possible, to prevent conflicts in this new domain. Therefore, we highly welcome the work of the last GGE group, and the report of July 2015 really brings added value to the report of 2013 that already was a landmark, acknowledging that international law applies. So the group of experts managed to build on the success of 2013 to bring the debate forward. What strikes me in this new report and in the work of the last group is the ability of the experts to intellectually frame the concept of peacetime norms. I remember 2 years ago, before the beginning of the last group, there was a relative reluctance to tackle this issue. It was considered potentially controversial because there was not enough international law there in order for this discussion to be based on solid ground. And the general thought was that the GGE would mainly focus on the applicability of the law of armed conflicts. At the same time, it was obvious, and still obvious, that though critical, attacks above the threshold of armed conflicts are not what we see every day going through our networks. So it was absolutely necessary to characterize this gray area, which is above cybercrime but under the threshold of armed conflict, while at the same time continuing the discussion on the applicability of the law of armed conflict. So in order to contribute to this emerging discussion, France proposed that with other countries proposed that the notion of critical infrastructure be used as some kind of symbolic threshold in this domain. The idea being that an attack, again, a critical infrastructure, may not amount to the level of armed conflict, but still falls in the national security domain, and as such, must be regulated by peacetime norms. So therefore, we try to submit to the group two kinds of norms proposal. The first one being that states have to protect themselves. They have to put in place the protective framework for their critical infrastructure. They have to identify them and then to protect them. And the second kind of norms that we submitted to the group was that states should have the responsibility to avoid or mitigate attacks coming from their territory when they target another state's critical infrastructure. So here, peacetime norms are really meant to be conflict prevention tools, as attacks against critical infrastructure are the most likely to escalate into larger conflicts. So to conclude, and I'll be very brief, while we and most of the people thought that the last GGE was about to work on how to deal with armed conflict in cyberspace, the GGE ended up working mostly on how to prevent them. And I think that's a strong message that the group sent to the international community, and I hope that we'll be able to implement this norm and to continue the debate on the implementation later on this panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Chris Painter, who's coordinator for cyber issues at the State Department in Washington.
So I think I want to start just by saying that we've seen, I think, a growing maturity in terms of the way this topic's been dealt with. And when we talk about the concept of international cooperation, that's very important because in many years, even 5 or 6 years ago, we talked about technical cooperation between law enforcement, between CERTs, and that's important and that needs to be built and strengthened. But we really didn't have much policy coordination here. And my office at the State Department was set up now just a little over 4 years ago. We were the first one in the foreign ministry. There now are about 25, I think, all around the world. And there's a recognition that this is not just an issue, a technical issue, which I think had predominated for some time, but it is an issue of national security, of economic security, of human rights. It is a policy issue, a foreign policy issue, and a policy issue that really deserves attention at the very highest levels of government. And I think that really means there has to be both a cooperation on a technical level, but also this being dealt with at a policy level. And we're seeing that, and certainly that's true in the US. Part of the way that's played out, and just talking about, and I do want to talk about the GG report a bit too, is the way we end up dealing with this around the world. One of my colleagues mentioned the number of bilateral arrangements. There were no bilateral all-of-government cyber dialogues even 4.5 years ago. There now are, we have 7 or 8 of them. I think every state has them. I think that again shows the importance of this issue. We have one with Germany. We have discussions with France. We have them with the EU. We have, and these are all of government, not just the foreign ministries, but the security ministries and the economic ministries. We just completed one with India recently in DC, and we have a very strong one with Japan. And we just did this recently where Japan, just like many of us, Germany and others, but Japan and the US share a lot of very strong common values, including on the theft of intellectual property, the threats that we're facing, and how we work together. So we've seen this common view, and it was also exemplified in the global cyberspace conference that the Dutch hosted, of more and more countries understanding this and coming together. And I think that's important. Now, so can we cooperate? Absolutely. Are there still things that we're not going to agree on? And this is my transition to the GG report. We're not, for instance, going to adopt the absolutist view of sovereignty that is put forward by our Russian colleagues and our Chinese colleagues. We do think that there are limits to sovereignty, and that some of those limits are where you have, for instance, international human rights. I would take issue with one thing my colleague said about the GG report, which is I don't think it says the next GG should now draft binding rules. I think it says, and it does say, we should continue to talk about these issues and norms and elucidate them, and also how international law applies in cyberspace. Nevertheless, I do think it's interesting that, as my French colleague said, that we were able to reach an agreement among a lot of different countries, both developed and developing countries, on some core concepts. We probably did not go as far as we wanted to go in terms of how international law applies, and that needs to be dealt with in the future more definitely. But we did get some good statements there in terms of the whole UN Charter, including issues of proportionality, distinction apply when you have that very high threshold. But we did come up with some, I think, really important peacetime norms. And again, this is something that in the US we've been championing for some time, but just in the last couple of years. And looking at that threshold below that very high threshold, what is it that you can have that's going to make the environment more stable? So you deal with non-state actors through criminal laws and cooperation between CERTs. And we've had many examples of that in the US where we've reached out to countries all around the world, both on a political level and a diplomatic level, but also on a technical level, when we've had, for instance, the denial of service attacks against our financial institutions. But you also then want to make the entire environment more stable when you have state actors. And so the significance, I think, of these peacetime norms that we discussed a little bit already are really important for that greater stability. So, for example, not attacking the critical infrastructure, absent wartime, of another state is important. That a state shouldn't do that. Not attacking the computer emergency response team or the CSIRT of another country. It's almost like it's going after an ambulance. It is inherently destabilizing to go after the people who are actually trying to clean up the mess, and I think that's really important. Not using a CSIRT for anything other than defensive purposes. Again, I think a really important stabilizing issue. And then this issue of when malicious activity is coming from your border and you have a request that you should use your best efforts to mitigate that either through technical means or law enforcement means. And again, this is trying to create a larger stable environment. So that's very important. And when you couple that with the confidence building measures that try to get countries who may not talk a lot about these issues and who haven't really maybe even figured out their own doctrine to start sharing information, that's really significant as well. So I do think that there was some real movement there, and this is something that I think we think is quite important. There's also, but this is not the exhaustion of all norms. For instance, another norm the US has been very vocal about is the theft of trade secrets and intellectual property by states. We've been vocal with China and others about that we think is off limits. Now, that's less a political military norm like the three we talked about in the GG report, but it's one we feel strongly about as well. So I do think that this development, this affirmation of these norms is a great building block going forward. Of course, and I think we'll discuss this, Joe, how do you then take that forward in the larger international stage? And I think there are lots of ways we can do that for particular ones. And I do think it's important to continue to have these discussions where we talk about these issues, while at the same time not trying to run to some binding agreement that in fact is not ripe, because when we talk about norms, we have to figure out what those norms are, and then you look down the line at how to enforce those. So with that, I'll stop.
Thank you.
Ryuichi Hirano is listed third on the program, but is last today not because of any disrespect for Japan or Asia, but because there was some uncertainty about whether his airplane would land on time. So very practical in the East-West context. In any case, he is a counselor for International Strategy Group, National Center of Incident Readiness and Strategy for Cybersecurity, reporting to the Cabinet Secretariat of Japan.
Thank you very much, Professor Nye. It's my great pleasure to be here with the distinguished panelists. Well, let me speak about 3 points. The first one is how we, our view on current situation. And the second point is about our principles in cybersecurity policy of Japan, which are indicated in newly adopted cybersecurity strategy document of the Japanese government. And the third point is our willingness towards international cooperation. So the first one, the current situation. Well, cyberspace continues to develop rapidly based on freedom and initiatives of the private sector. It has already become a foundation of socio-economic activities. In the near future, well, with the development of IoT systems or cyber-physical systems, we expect an emergence of what we say an interconnected and converged information society, where cyberspace and real space have become highly integrated. On the other hand, in Japan, well, cyber threats, especially to the government agencies, increased drastically during last 2 or 3 years. And in addition, in June this year, about 1.25 million personal records have been stolen from the Japan Pension Service Organization. That case attracted big political attention in Japan. Well, and these cyber attacks have become a serious threat that crosses national borders, and they can no longer be tackled by one company or one state alone. So our basic principles, well, based on the understanding of the circumstances and based on the lessons learned in this new Japan Pension Service case, Japan made cabinet decision and officially adopted a comprehensive cybersecurity strategy document last Friday on September 4th. Looking towards the prospects further ahead for the early 2020s, this strategy outlined the basic directions of Japan's cybersecurity policy, approximately for upcoming 3 years. What should we do in order to ensure free, fair, and secure cyberspace in cooperation with all the relevant actors? One possible way is acting with common understanding with various entities, various stakeholders. It was mentioned in our cybersecurity strategy. We uphold following five principles as basic principles we should have. Those are first, assurance of the free flow of information. Second, the rule of law. Third, openness. Fourth, self-governance. Fifth, cooperation among multi-stakeholders. So we cannot support information control by oppressive regimes. We further will make contribution to the efforts on the application of existing international law to cyberspace. Well, we will oppose exclusively dominated by a certain group of actors and respect governance of various participating actors. And the third point, international cooperation. Well, these five principles are our basic recognition, and we think following 4 points should be promoted for international cooperation. The first one, yes, developing and materializing international rules and norms. Well, we also actively contributed to the discussion on how to apply the international law to cyberspace in the UN Cyber GGE, and also in the process of a World Conference on Cyberspace. Well, as for the latest GGE report, if possible, I would like to add some words later as well, especially about those peacetime norms issues. Well, and second point is the international confidence building measures. We will share our basic positions and policies with many countries at bilateral and multilateral fora in order to avoid, well, first of all, unexpected situations stemming from one cyber incident. In addition, we will conduct contact or communication exercises and other measures for transnational cyber incidents. The third point is measures against international criminal activities, including terrorism. The fourth point is cybersecurity capacity building. We will further actively cooperate on capacity building to other countries, including those in Southeast Asia. Well, we are determined to activate these efforts together with multi-stakeholders, which include governments and the private sector around the world, to ensure a free, fair, and secure cyberspace. That is the indispensable basis of today's socio-economic activities and for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we've heard the view that there is a fair amount of cooperation and could be more, but if we dig down one layer deeper on this and ask about implementation, I wonder if this consensus will fall apart. You can say, for example, every country is against cybercrime, and even when we can't agree on certain aspects, you can say, well, there are things that are doubly criminal, that if they're criminal in both systems, like credit card fraud, we should be able to agree on that. But then you look at the actual implementation. You look at mutual legal assistance treaties, MLATs. You realize that it takes about a year to implement an MLAT request. And you say, well, wait a minute, when we look at implementation, it's not so clear that cooperation is really there. I mean, we can agree on a principle, but when you start saying, okay, implementation doesn't look quite so impressive of cooperation on the internet. So let me take that point about the difficulties of implementation and pick up the little colloquy between Messrs. Hambrecht and Rogachev on the issue of Estonia and Georgia. One of the principles in the GGE report is that a state is responsible, a sovereign state is responsible for what originates in its territory, whether it's the government that does it or not. And if there's some controversy about whether it's the government or some other actor, there is a responsibility to assist, to help. So essentially, if there is a disagreement on who was involved in this, there should be forensic assistance, not just appearing at panels and denying or claiming. Was there any forensic assistance offered? Is it possible that there could be forensic assistance? In other words, when you get from the level of the principle that's in the GGE report that you're supposed to help, has there been any evidence of help? Maybe we should ask Mr. Hembrecht and then Mr. Rogachev on this.
That's really an interesting but also difficult question. And let me start by the following. If you look into our cyberspace, it's a trivial statement when you say there are no borders, but there's a fundamental implication regarding also what you touched in your question. If you look into cyber incidents, it's for the first time in our society the same technology in the same way used in different areas. What I mean by this? If you take any malware, and the similar example is Stuxnet, when you remember this, the Iranian plutonium. If you take Stuxnet, because I think everyone knows it, you can use it for sabotage, you can use it for asymmetric warfare, you can use it for blackmailing, attacking infrastructures. So this means it's the same software, a little bit adjusted from a technical perspective, used in a lot of cases. I think we only know the other examples are a pistol you can use to defend it or to shoot somebody. Yeah? So, but the point is, if you're now inside the situation, in this, let's say, European environment, I only take Estonia, then the situation is, if it happens and you are third, the first question is, what was it? So then you try to find out, and remember it was 2007, what I said in the beginning, we started with this cooperation 2010-11, and then with the first exercises from this lesson learned. So it's difficult to say it. And then the next question is forensics. It's difficult. And it's difficult for the following reason. If you only go a couple of months ago, we had in Europe, in France, the attack on TV 5 where they changed the website. Yeah? So it's again the same that you say, is it an Islamic State? Is it some kind of terrorist? Is it some kind of criminals? So you start this investigation. And then it comes that if you are now in, let's say, France, Estonia, or wherever, you have your own intelligence, you start to understand, then you have limitation. Then you have your network, you go to other states, you ask them. So in the end, it comes to the point that if it comes to intelligence, even if you know it, you put it then top secret. You don't talk about it. Yeah? It's either the national sovereignty, because the Estonians want to disclose it, the French don't want to disclose it, or the Europeans don't want to disclose it. So to summarize this, what I want to say is, the challenge is the technology is used in a lot of areas with different legal, let's say, background. The second point is it's difficult to detect where it comes from, what was the intention. And the third point is, if you are in this network, then the question, how much do you disclose?
Thank you. Mr. Rogachev, would Russia be prepared to offer forensic assistance on these cases?
Well, this is not really a question for me, but first the thing that I would like to say here is that let's differentiate between the cases of military and political use of ICTs. And when ICTs are used to commit crimes for profit, and then the word forensic will be really well placed, talking about investigations. Then, of course, there is a question of transboundary investigations, which is very, very dubious in our view legally. And we know that the European Council of Europe Convention of 2001, so-called Budapest Convention, allows transboundary investigations, but we do not think that this is the right way to carry out policy and your interests. Another element would be is that sometimes, as I've been told by the experts, as I'm not an IT specialist myself, it is very difficult, and sometimes it is even impossible to find out where does the certain malicious activity come from. It is easier, of course, in the situation when there is a purely criminal activity, like I said, the crimes for profit are committed. It is much highly more sophisticatedly disguised in certain cases of political and military use of ICTs. I agree also that there are many reasons to not to disclose the source of knowledge if the source of threat is identified. Well, I can give many examples in both of these areas, but let's take child pornography, for example. Some states have been campaigning for many years already, internationally, I mean, first of all, pressing for enhanced international cooperation of states between law enforcement bodies to curtail the proliferation of child pornography on the internet. But, well, I have to mention again the United States here. But experts know that 80 to 85% of the content related to this area comes from the servers that are located on the territory of the United States. So this fact, but also others, like let's take attack on the cyber resources of holding Le Monde. Last spring, I think, it was attacked, and the attack was attributed, please remind me if I'm mistaken, to Al-Qaeda. Affiliates of Al-Qaeda. Well, but the attack came from the territories physically, from servers that were located on the territories of 2 European states. Again, let's take attack on what was that? The Sony, in connection with the release of a film. That was not an attack by the North Korea, and experts know that. Experts know that. Nobody wanted to just to speak up about this fact, that it was not the North Korea. Neither Russia nor China, for example. So there are many reasons. There are very different reasons for that. But hence there are two ideas, two proposals that Russia is pressing on internationally, and that is that the state should be held accountable and responsible for what's happening on its territory physically. This is the new provision of the report of the working group that I have mentioned. Well, basically this is it. Thank you.
Okay, but if I could just get clarity on your point of why you thought that forensic assistance is not appropriate. Your government has signed on to, in the UNGGE report, the July report, state shall respond to appropriate measures, appropriate requests for assistance by another state. What was your objection to responding to requests for assistance from another state? You said that in the Budapest Convention you disagreed with the idea of having an obligation of forensic assistance, and you've signed in the GGE report that states should provide assistance. Is there a contradiction here?
No, in fact, no. There's no contradiction. I will just try to explain myself better. We are not against providing forensic assistance to each other, not at all. We insist on having more sophisticated, more speedy procedures in the area. The problem with the Budapest Convention is that it allows transboundary investigations in cyberspace of another state without even having notified this state. Not only asking permission or cooperating somehow, but without even notification of the authorities of this state.
Okay, that helpful. Thank you.
Article 32B.
Yeah. Well, I know about 32B. Let me turn to Mr. Roland and ask him a question about implementation. You referred to France's position against attacks on critical infrastructure. How would you know if an attack had occurred? In other words, suppose you found in a grid in France a piece of malware. How do we, I mean, we have in the UNGG report this very nice principle that we should cooperate on the norm of attacking critical infrastructure. Do we know enough that we can enforce a norm like that? I mean, what's the attribution problem of for example, you find the malware, then what? Where's the cooperation then?
I think the question of implementation of the norms contained in the last GGE report is a fundamental question, and from the ability of states to implement this norm will depend the success of further work by the GGE or other fora. I think that the two keywords for implementation are transparency and capacity development or capacity building. First, transparency. You just mentioned critical infrastructure. The word critical infrastructure appears a lot in the report, but it might reflect different reality for different countries. So countries have to be transparent about what they consider a critical infrastructure. Of course, they don't have to disclose the list of critical infrastructure. Nobody wants to give a target list to its enemy, but they have to share views on what is considered critical, what are the criteria of critical infrastructure, what is the definition. And the same is valid for certs. We talk a lot about certs in the report, but most of the time there is no clear information about the governmental cert of certain country. We don't have enough information on their real mandate, on the point of contacts that could be useful in case of a crisis. So I think here we really have to work on transparency, and the work at the level of the OSCE I think is a good forum for increased transparency, which will at the end increase confidence. I think without transparency we won't have enough confidence to implement these norms. And the second keyword for me would be capacity development, capacity building. I think that there is not a single country today whose level of capacity is sufficient to enable a sound implementation of the whole GGE report. Without even talking about technical capacity, let's just focus on institutional capacity. If you take the norm on assistance, for instance, that we're talking about, most of the countries, I think, lack the human resources to be able to implement this norm in some conditions, and they also lack the international procedures. So first, the lack of human resources, it takes time and manpower to be able to deal with requests for assistance by other countries, and it might not always be the priority, and we can all understand this. Maybe in the future you could think about dedicated people in agencies working only on dealing with assistance for requests, but that's still the future. Even if every country has to look into this direction. And second, you need adequate procedures, and we've been talking about a mutual legal assistance treaty, and there's a work by the EWI on this issue to enable and to implement standard procedures. I think that's a good move, and there's also the work at European level, and Mr. Hembrecht mentioned the work ongoing at EU level on the Network and Information Security Directive. I think this is a good way to start at regional level to put in place standard procedures in case of crisis, and to define how the states will be able to cooperate together. And I'm really glad to share the panel with Mr. Hembrecht, because I understand that ENISA will have a strong role in supporting these efforts aimed at enhancing cooperation at regional level. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me turn to Chris Painter now, but I'd like to ask two questions. One is if you would follow up on the question I asked to Lino Roland about you've long proposed this idea of a norm against attacks on critical infrastructure. How would you answer the question I asked him? And then the second question for you is, in your remarks, Chris, you mentioned the idea of developing a norm against commercial espionage, cyber espionage. Do you think you're making any progress on that? Or do most states basically treat espionage as espionage, and the Americans are the outliers in the sense that what we make the distinction of commercial espionage and other states don't make that distinction? Are you getting more or less cooperation on this?
So to start with the first question, and I should just preface it also by saying that even when you're talking about these issues that you raised in the beginning, like mutual legal assistance, there are things beyond the very formal process, the 24/7 network, the fast freeze network, ways to cooperate informally. So it's not really a complete picture to say.
Or Charlie Hebdo is a good example.
Right. So in other words, you can have very fast cooperation, and indeed we're trying to improve that. President Obama is trying to streamline our MLAT process, and that's important. But that's a challenge certainly, but it's not without some solutions. On the issue of that you raised, look. Attribution is tough. Attribution is not impossible. You don't just look at technical attribution. You can look at a whole bunch of factors. And I will tell you, for the people who say that North Korea was not responsible for the Sony attack, that's just flatly wrong. And I'm sorry if you disagree with me, but you haven't seen and you're not going to see all the evidence behind that. And that's just the way it is. So there is evidence that you can gather, and you can look at attribution. And so if you do see, for instance, a malicious piece of code whose only real purpose would be to take down an infrastructure, and you can make that attribution, that would be significant. And I think that would open up a range of different options that a state could use in terms of how they respond to that. But I think you can do that. And so I do think that that's important. And when you look at how, if that would constitute an attack on a critical infrastructure, it could well be an attempt. And if you can show that, I think that'd be significant. So that's one. On the second issue, remind me again the second issue?
Well, the question of whether you're getting more or less cooperation on your distinction.
I do think this is a distinction that a lot of countries do see as meritorious, because I think that it is true that every country gathers intelligence. That's not going to change. That's been true from the beginning of mankind. But when you target companies and take really the life's blood of the economy, so you'll have not just a deleterious effect on the victim companies, but on the whole national security and economic security of the country. And the benefit that the countries who do this is sort of short-lived, because you may get a quick gain, but you don't really have the long-term capability. I think it makes a difference. And I do think it's getting traction. I think certainly some of the countries, without going into too much detail, who do these kinds of activities maybe don't see the distinction. But more and more of the countries, and even those countries, as they develop their own intellectual property, I think will see a benefit in this. So my sense is that there is growing, especially in the trade circles, growing understanding that this is an important norm going forward. It is one we have to continue to promote, because I do think this it has long-term and very dire consequences for the world economy if this is the kind of activity that we don't really try to stop.
Thank you.
And the norm is just one way to do that. There's other ways to do it as well.
Udo Helmbrecht wanted to come in on this point, and then I want to turn to Thomas Fitschen.
I think you really touched a good point on this espionage and your question. I just want to give an example why it is so difficult. And if you give an example, you see if it's already difficult in Europe, how difficult it is on the, let's say, globe. In Germany, we distinguish between state espionage and industrial espionage, and it's different agencies who discuss it and support and try to defend it. The interesting thing is now, if you look on the European construction, the Lisbon Treaty in 2009, there are only very few things in national sovereignty. And even a lot of citizens in Europe don't recognize this because this is a political evolution. And among these things, there are a few military things, finance things, and intelligence things. This is, I think, only 5 or 7 points. So these are essential: finance policy, defense policy, intelligence. In our IT business, it's very difficult to distinguish this. Now, if you look into the NIS directive, on the NIS directive, we don't have a European intelligence service. As you said, everyone spies on each other but doesn't talk about it. So this is difficult now if we make an information exchange of the thirds. Because you gather information from public sources, intelligence sources from your network, but you want to make a directive where you only talk about information exchange with the European level. Yeah? So we are struggling with this, and what I say here, it's a way that in a lot of cases it is never written down. It's somewhere in the background. So it makes it difficult to find a solution, what you say, how to get it into a norm in the end.
Thank you. Mr. Fitschen, you mentioned in your comments another set of norms. We've talked a lot about security norms and about crime, but there's another set that you mentioned which I think we should pay some attention to in terms of cooperation in cyberspace. That's privacy. And you mentioned the importance of privacy, and you said you and Brazil had put in a resolution. But what do you do about cultural definitions of privacy? I mean, for example, the Americans think that they pay a great deal of attention to privacy, and Europeans think they pay a great deal of attention to privacy, but they culturally define it in rather different ways. Are you seeing increased cooperation in the issue of privacy norms in cyberspace, or decreased cooperation?
Well, as for...
No, this is for Mr. Fitschen, and then I'm going to turn to you, Mr. Rano. Yeah.
No, I mean, the process we have had at the General Assembly level and also in the Human Rights Council, of course, took a very, let's say, legalistic approach, because the formulation were always privacy as defined in the relevant human rights treaties. So it's a very legalistic approach, and of course, concepts, once you start drilling up the concepts and the notions, you get into the difficulties that you have mentioned. But of course, if you want really international cooperation, sometimes it's helpful not to be too precise about the terms, but to keep it strictly to, and to link it very clearly to a text that everyone has signed up to. And then of course, once you have to follow up, you have to look at national implementation, and then the different concepts become clearer. But to allow cooperation at the Human Rights Council or General Assembly level, diplomats would always leave this rather open and refer to the textual concept.
But if you take something like the right to be forgotten, which the European courts have approved, for many Americans that's seen as Stalinist history, in which you rewrite history to take out awkward things. But for Europeans, this is an essential part of privacy. How are we going to reconcile that?
Well, again, it's a matter of national legislation. I don't think that this debate about two general concepts leads us anywhere in our international cooperation. We have to rely on what we have, and those are the norms that we have signed up to, the resolutions, of course, the kind of inaccuracy in the norms that we use, in the notions that we use, and the concepts that we put in resolutions is the necessary diplomatic tool of the trade. But those general debates that you're mentioning, what is behind this and how Americans and Europeans and others, of course, I don't know, Asian, Japanese concepts may be different again. That is something that certainly needs to be discussed. but I don't want to overestimate those because it may sometimes block the type of cooperation that we are looking for. You have to make a start with some, let's say, simple or rather broad concepts and norms and not worry too much about what is behind this.
Thank you.
That would be my position as a diplomat.
Yeah, thank you. Finally, let me turn, before we turn to the audience, let me turn to Mr. Hirano and ask a question about the role of CERTs and cooperation in East Asia, which you mentioned in your comments. We know from public accounts that the last year or so have been difficult in the relations between Japan, China, and Korea. There have been problems of getting meetings among top leaders. There have been problems of how one responds to the various statements about the 70th anniversary of World War II. It's been a diplomatically a difficult period for the last couple of years. On the other hand, there is a CERT that includes Japan, Korea, and China. And I'm told that that CERT works quite well. Can you give us examples of how CERT-to-CERT cooperation has overcome these diplomatic tensions? In other words, that there is cooperation that's greater in the internet than one would expect from the larger diplomatic relationships.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, as you said, we have CERT cooperation among the three countries: Japan, China, Korea. They meet. They are having annual meetings, and they I'm sure they're exchanging quite practical information, such as including yes, specific information on malwares as well. Yes, and in addition to that, I would like to mention that well, we had the meeting of trilateral whole of government cyber dialogue, cyber talks with China and Korea last year. Well, yes, many times many people will speak about confidence building or transparency, and this was a very good opportunity to have a mutual transparency. The meeting was held last year, and we all, the three countries, introduced the basic positions on cybersecurity policy, and also we introduced the government structure on assurance of cybersecurity. That was, I'm sure that was a very good opportunity, and I think we will continue this framework as well. And this can help to somewhat ease political tension. I mean, in practical level, we indicated that our cooperation is going on. Thank you.
Thank you. We have about 20 minutes left for audience participation. There are microphones, as you can see. If you want to ask a question, please identify which participant you asked the question to, and also identify yourself. And if you're interested, please come forward to a microphone. So, here you are.
Good morning. My name is Oleg Demidov from PIR Center in Moscow. This is a non-governmental think tank. If I might, I would have two questions, one to Mr. Painter and one to Mr. Rogachev. First question goes to Mr. Painter. Thank you very much for your speech and your comments. And my question would, to some extent, repeat the question that Dr. Nye already asked, but I would like to make a more narrow accent. So this recently announced strategy to impose sanctions based on the April executive order by Mr. Obama for attacks on critical infrastructure in cyberspace, for disrupting major US networks, and for cyber espionage and benefiting from cyber espionage against the United States. My question would be, do you need ever any international trans-border exchange of information, cooperation, data sharing, to be able to make effective attribution of those persons or legal entities who are responsible for such acts and who will be punished in terms of these sanctions. Would the procedure of identifying, attributing such cases be transparent itself from the international point of view? That is the question.
And why don't you ask your question to Mr. Rogachev also, and then we can have two answers.
The question is about the regional formats of cooperation on confidence and trust building measures in cyberspace in which Russia is being involved for recent years. We were very active and successful on bilateral track with the United States. We contributed greatly to the efforts within the OSCE track, but there is another track which is very promising and which might be very successful, and where Russia's participation was very significant too. This is IRF, ASEAN Regional Forum, where we were co-chairs with Malaysia and Australia in terms of elaboration and adoption of the plan, ARF plan for cybersecurity or something like that. And the last information I have about it that it should have been adopted 1 year ago. And still I have no information what is going on now within ASEAN and IRF track on cooperation in cyberspace. I'm wondering, because this is a very promising regional format and Russia was one of the leaders and co-sponsors, co-chairs of this activity. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris, you're first.
So a couple things. First of all, on sanctions, despite what you may read in the press, the sanctions have not been used yet. There's a framework out. The framework was from April. And it was the first time that sanctions as an additional tool could be used, economic sanctions, in order to try to address the malicious conduct we see, a range of different malicious conduct we see. It's an additional thing we felt we needed to apply here. But it's not a different sanctions regime than any other sanctions regime that the U.S. has, whether it's against terrorism, whether against transnational crime. Yes, it requires a certain level of proof, certainly, but that proof can be based on both things that are public and things that are not public, just like ordinary investigations are. So as that order is used in the future, and it will be used in the future to address significant cyber conduct, not everyday stuff, significant, where other tools are really just not adequate, that test will be used as we go through the interagency. And just maybe one thing to note, as we looked at this, we had our criminal investigations you could do. You have diplomatic, you have trade tools. This is an additional tool that we thought was important, and it's been used in other areas. So applying it now to the cyber area, we think is an important way to try to dissuade and actually address cyber conduct. I have one thing to say on ARF. I think ARF is really an important forum to carry forward the discussion, particularly around confidence building measures. And indeed, I believe Singapore will be hosting a session on this coming up fairly soon. So this is not, it is ongoing work. You may not have heard about the ongoing work, but there's a lot of work going on in ARF. It's an important forum. OSCE, obviously another important forum. But using various regional forums, and there's even been some work in OAS, I think it's important to bring this work forward and continue to make progress on it.
Thank you. Mr. Rogachev.
Thank you very much. In fact, you mentioned more than just regional formats of cooperation by the Russian Federation with the foreign partners. You mentioned also bilateral US-Russia relationship in this area. As for regional formats, there is an important development in the OSCE, and we hope the organization will continue on this path, that experts will be able to develop the set of trust-building measures that is already there. For us, well, we are not limited by any measure to European regional, also ARF, as you said, which is so promising that we could not adopt for a year, almost agreed upon the plan. I don't want to be too sarcastic on that, but now it is mostly for some formalities rather than substantive issues. But well, I don't know exactly what do you mean by using this word promising format. It doesn't look so in this area, at least. This plan of action that has been agreed upon in Asian Regional Forum is not very far-reaching. Let's be honest. Well, of course, everything is relative, but we think that other formats like Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, organization that like BRICS format, are most promising, as there we have very much like-minded countries, and we can agree on many difficult issues. Elsewhere, we have to argue even about terminology. Like here, you know, in Russia, we stick to this phrase international information security, and it is much broader than the cyberspace. And when we talk about the security in the use of ICTs, we do not single out internet, and unlike our moderator did by introducing the subject matter of this panel, we have in mind, we imply also the content, because the content can be used for different purposes. And can be used maliciously, in particular, also by different actors. So there are promising formats, and those are not formats where we have to try to come to agreement on what are we talking about. It is still a very much unresolved issue internationally. We refer in these cases to the United Nations report, to these documents that are there, to the UNGA resolutions, and so on. But it is still to be discussed. The vocabulary is still a relatively weak point in this area. We still have to work on that before we try to bring in some much more complicated issues. As to our bilateral relationship with the US in the field, the consultations that seemed to us very important and very welcomed by the two parties are unfortunately frozen for some political reasons because of the Russian position on the crisis in Ukraine, just as well as 28 other working subgroups of the so-called Presidential Commission, Russia-US Presidential Commission. So,
thank you.
It is non-existent for a moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Next question.
I'm Teresa Hitchens, and I am with the Center for International and Security Studies at Maryland, at the University of Maryland. And my question is for Mr. Helmbrecht. You mentioned something that nobody else talked about here, and that was the sometimes difficulty of cooperating with industry and resolving problems, because industry sometimes is reluctant to report things that have happened or the extent to which they might have been breached. And I was wondering how you are addressing that in the EU, within the EU system with regards to developing legislation, et cetera. On one hand, I understand the need for having strong industry participation in this, but on the other hand, I also sometimes understand industry's reluctance, given that they are concerned about heavy-handed government regulation.
Okay, thanks for the question. I think there's a basic challenge. If you work in governmental area, you have governance structure. And what we talked about is, you know whom to talk in government ministry. It's all well organized from member states to the UN. If you go to industry, it's difficult. You have small, big, you have associations. So it's a challenge how do you, let's say, organize it. So the experience is when we come from a governmental institution to sectors, this is how we do it. there's a reluctance to say, okay, now you sit together with competitors. If I disclose something, does he misuse it? How do we do it? So it takes a lot of time of trust building. It's the same on a governmental level if you have trust building between states, but in industry with this competitive point, it takes longer. So where we are now is in Europe, we have the telecommunication sector where we have breach notification to regulatory bodies and to ENISA. And we discussed with industry and regulatory bodies in a process, let's say 12 to 18 months, to have the threshold. So this was a trust building. So now the challenge in the ENISA directive that we will enhance it to the energy sector, transport sector. Germany already started for the health sector. So by this we will take the so-called critical infrastructure sectors, put them in the legislation, and then we will discuss with the industry of these sectors what kind of threshold we will have in the reporting. It's a long process, but those who are working, let's say, on diplomatic level, you can learn a lot from your level when we do it with industry, how to build trust.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you very much. It's a little low for me. My name is Simone Halink. I work for the Dutch government and team for cyber policies. And I would like the panel to think a little bit further about cooperation in cyberspace on the issue of privacy. I greatly value the effort of the Germans and the Brazilians to push for the privacy resolutions and for the mandate of a special rapporteur. The Dutch have supported this effort. And I understand the reference to international norms as a starting point, but I'm stuck with the thought, if we leave the implementation just to the national level and don't develop that discussion on the international level, I'm afraid that we don't get much further, because we see that the way in which some countries implement these norms deviate from what we've agreed to on an international level. We now have a special rapporteur that starts to sort of the research on this important topic. But I think it's important that in parallel, countries continue a conversation on this topic and see if we in parallel can develop it further. So what I would like to ask the panel is, what other efforts countries together could initiate or develop to clarify, develop the privacy norms that we have? How do we implement them on a national level? How can we develop that discussion further, apart from the UN track that we currently have?
Mr. Fitschen.
Yeah, thanks for reminding us of the enormous difficulty behind it. The process, which came from the General Assembly down back to the Human Rights Council, there we had a couple of experts meetings in preparation of the work of the Human Rights Council, and they revealed very clearly the difficulties. It's not so much an issue of privacy in cyberspace, but behind this is a very general debate on the reach of human rights obligations beyond your own borders. So is Germany or the US, to what extent are they bound to respect human rights norms that they have signed up to when they operate or get in touch with other countries? So there's a very general international legal debate behind this. It's not about necessarily about cyberspace only, but about our obligations under international law. So that discussion among the experts in Geneva showed very clearly that there is a lot of discontent and a lot of controversy in international legal scholarship on these issues, and differences between more European countries and the US and others about the reach of international human rights obligations. So that needs to be continued, that type of debate, in all the legal and academic fora that we have, so that we get more precision on that one. We've tried to involve the human rights, the treaty bodies, but they were reluctant to get involved, because they said, well, we have issued a general comment on the right to privacy a couple of years ago. We don't want to dig it up again and change the system. So there was a little reluctance on their part, which again makes it necessary to continue this debate among international legal scholars in the first place.
Thank you. We have time for one last question. It's yours.
Joe Marks from Politico. I wanted to ask Coordinator Painter and then anyone else on the panel who'd like to answer. You know, at this point, we have representatives from some of the largest economies on this stage right now. As more nations become cyber dependent and cyber vulnerable and develop cyber attack capabilities, things are going to get much more complicated. And does it make sense, how will that change this discussion, A, and B, does it make sense to start developing norms at this stage when there are significantly fewer players than there are going to be in maybe a decade?
So I think there is real value, for instance, the group of governmental experts to act as a crucible where you can get some agreement among countries, not just the developed countries. This last GG had a number of countries, including countries who are developing, and I think that's important. But remember the 2013 GG, and we took that forward collectively in a number of different venues, including in NATO, for instance. I know you'll be hearing from Ambassador De Caro tomorrow. So it kind of proliferates in different venues after you have this crucible decision to do it. I totally do agree, though. You need to involve as much of the world in some of these debates and discussions as you can. So the GG is one forum for doing this. But the fact that we've talked about regional forums like ARF, like OAS, like OSCE, to talk about things, practical confidence building measures, is important to get more of those countries involved. And recently, we've been doing, I know we've been leading a lot of capacity building efforts, and Roland mentioned this, in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. We've had discussions with the Gulf countries. We've had discussions with many countries about these topics. So it's not just the exclusive province of a small number of countries, but I do think there's value of having that GGE be the crucible that can work out some of these larger issues, and then you can proliferate that to other places. But it's a discussion that I think every country needs to have. A lot of the countries are developing capabilities, as you say, but also dependencies. And I think that it's important, especially as developing countries are getting cable drops and other ways to become much more connected to the internet, they'll see the importance of these issues, and it's important for them to be involved in debate. And that can be regionally, but it also can be in a number of other forums as well.
Well, we have, alas, run out of time. I'm not sure we fully exhausted our question, which is cooperation possible in cyberspace? I would submit that we have answered that question, yes, but in answering it, we found that there's still a long way to go when you scratch below the surface of the answer, yes. And for helping us to reach that conclusion, please thank our panelists.